Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, November 27th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We got to get through a lot of games today, but we are going to start talking a little bit about those CFP rankings that we had that came out yesterday. Definitely some different reactions to it, including this system is absolutely broken. The format definitely does need to be changed, and I'm sure it will be in the offseason. Then we'll get into a couple of big game breakdowns. We have Texas A&M. We have South Carolina, Clemson. Want to make sure I break down those guys for you first. Then we'll get into a couple of upset alerts, CFP hope battles, depending on the way you look at it. Notre Dame, USC, Miami, Syracuse, as well as Kansas State, Iowa State. A couple of huge games that could totally shake up the CFP race. Then we'll get into a couple of rivalries of the week. We'll get into clean old-fashioned hate happening in Athens. We'll get to the Iron Bowl. We'll get to the game. A lot of big-time games that we just got to dive into a little bit more. A lot of hate going around this weekend. And then we'll get to a little bit of a whip around of just all the other games. We'll get to Memphis, Tulane. We'll get to Oregon State, Boise State, Colorado's game against Oklahoma State. A lot of games that we have to get to today with the abbreviated week. We'll try to get in all the stuff that you guys need to know as we get into rivalry weekend. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use the super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $, add any question, comment you'd like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, especially as we get into the craziness that is the CFP race. Definitely want you guys to be able to ask all the questions you want, so utilize that super chat, or also GSMCPodcast.net does the exact same thing, so utilize either of those if you would like. But let's jump into this, because we have a CFP rankings that have been released yesterday, and a lot of things that I want to break down for you guys here. And I think with a lot of this stuff, it's very easy to kind of overreact. It's very easy to get a little bit crazy. Some of this stuff is going to change. I feel very confident that a lot of this stuff is going to change before we get to the final iteration of this thing. But let's get into the rankings first, and we'll start with the 25 to 13 here. And I think the biggest thing, at least from the bottom, is UNLV. I think they're in a position right now that is really, really advantageous. You have Army that has fallen out of the top 25 this week, and you're in a position where maybe if you went out, you would get the nod over a Boise State, and maybe even if Army beats Tulane, you would get the nod over an Army team that would be 12-1, you would be 11-2, but you would have that quality win over Boise State that Army doesn't necessarily have. Obviously, Tulane would be a quality win, but that would be an interesting thing to watch. Not having Army in these rankings at all leaves that door open for possibly UNLV to get that bid by themselves, as opposed to Boise State or Tulane or Army, that it felt like it was going to be one of those three even a couple of weeks ago. But Colorado does hang around in the top 25 this week. I think it gives them at least a slight opening to possibly be that Big 12 champion that gets into the mix. But we do got to talk about something here in a second, and actually let's just talk about it now. Tulane, they're at 17 right now, and they're sitting above Iowa State. They're sitting above at least 4 of the 5 teams in the Big 12 that are in the top 25 right now. If they were to win out, if Arizona State doesn't win the Big 12, let's say Iowa State doesn't win the Big 12 to just make it a little bit cleaner, if they don't win out, or if Tulane were to win out, would they jump that Big 12 champion? Could it be Tulane and Boise State in there instead of Boise State and Arizona State, or Tulane and Arizona State? Could it possibly be just no Big 12 champion in the mix? I do think that could be a reality if you avoid those top 3 teams, Arizona State, Iowa State, and BYU. If Kansas State, Colorado, or really anyone else wins it, I think that door is open. I think if anyone beyond Colorado wins it, I feel very confident that it would be Tulane above those teams, and I really wouldn't have too big of an argument about it. I think if it's anyone in the top 25, they probably would jump over Tulane, but as it sits right now, they're sitting pretty far behind them, and it would be interesting to see if Tulane can get in and the Big 12 could just be left out, which would be absolutely wild, but it's definitely on the table with only a couple of weeks left. You also have Missouri there. They are the committee's darling, it seems, and definitely helping out some SEC teams up top. You also have Illinois hanging around in the top 25 doing the exact same thing for Penn State and a couple other teams, so it's kind of just the game that we're playing right now. There's going to be a couple of teams in here that aren't necessarily CFP bound or have the shot for the CFP, but definitely deserve a little bit of a spot in the top 25. A&M at 20 all but confirms that they have to win the SEC, and that's the only path for them to get into the playoff. I do believe pretty much everyone has come around to that side of thinking, and I would be surprised if really anything else was the case. And then obviously the Big 12 teams are in the exact same boat: BYU, Iowa State, Arizona State. So going to be really interesting to see how all that breaks down, and that Tulane team just continues to play well. If they win out the rest of the way, there's a real world where the Big 12 just gets entirely left out, even with a Colorado or a Kansas State winning this thing. So would be absolutely crazy. But this, to me, I want to get to South Carolina here for a second. I think this buries South Carolina. I'd love to say that it doesn't, but they do play Clemson this upcoming weekend. I think even a win over Clemson, I think it would help out Ole Miss and Alabama more than it would help out South Carolina. I'd be a little bit surprised if they were to jump Alabama and Ole Miss if they were to beat Clemson. Maybe they'll do that. Maybe they'll give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt if they're able to get the win this weekend, but it feels more and more like South Carolina's path to the playoff is very, very slim. It looks like they're respecting that head-to-head that they have against Ole Miss and Alabama above really all else, so it could be a win this weekend for South Carolina. Actually helps Alabama more than it helps South Carolina, so would be a little bit of an interesting diatribe there. Maybe South Carolina would jump those two teams and find their way into the field if they beat Clemson, but definitely puts you in a tough spot. Being behind Alabama, being behind Ole Miss, puts you in a really tough spot to find your way in there as an at-large bid. So Alabama is still in it. They need one team to fall as far as I'm concerned. They do need Clemson as well to lose probably, but a Notre Dame, a Penn State, even Tennessee, if they were to lose, I do think Alabama would be that next team in there. Granted, if Clemson were to lose to South Carolina. So they're still in it. Ole Miss in a tougher spot. A lot of insane things would have to happen for Ole Miss to get in, but as we saw last week, that's not necessarily off the table by any means. So obviously it will be really interesting to watch this unfold. And then you do have the top 12, and you have Clemson sitting right there. They're in the Tennessee seat that was there last week. We'll see if they can get in the way Tennessee did this past weekend, and then we'll see if they have an at-large bid on the table. I do think they do. They'll probably need a little bit of help somewhere, but definitely an opening for Clemson to win the game this weekend, even if they don't go to the ACC championship, get a possible at-large bid, and sit there with 3 ACC teams in this thing at the end of the day. Then you do have Boise State sitting steady at 11. Feels like they're kind of comfortably there. The Big 12 is closing the gap for that possible bye. If Arizona State were to win out, I think they might be able to jump them, but definitely will be interesting to watch how much they jump if they win this weekend or something like that. So definitely will be interesting to see how all that unfolds. Indiana falls to 10, but a win on Saturday puts them in. I think it's pretty firmly, they're comfortably in the field at this point. SMU likely in the same boat, but 10-2 Clemson and 11-2 SMU could be an interesting hypothetical. Let's say SMU were to win this weekend but lose to Miami in the conference championship, and they're up against a 10-2 Clemson. Would be an interesting conversation, no doubt about that. I probably would lean SMU because I don't love punishing people for playing in their championship, but definitely would be a fun one, and I think these two teams not having played each other in the regular season opens that door just a little bit. Georgia and Tennessee are in the win-and-in scenarios right about now. Can't think that they're going to really fall off by any means. Georgia obviously has to be careful. If they lose to Georgia Tech this weekend and then lose in the SEC championship, I think they could get left out. Probably a pretty far-fetched, but we'll see what happens. And then we will see if that Georgia Tech game, this upcoming weekend for Georgia, is measured against Miami. Maybe they jump Miami after this weekend if they're able to get that win. We'll see what happens there. But Miami, we'll talk about them here for a second. They continue to be the more overranked teams in this thing. I really like Miami. I think they're capable of a lot of things. I probably would have put them right around 10 and slotted everyone up one more position. That being said, understand that a lot of people think they are the best team in the ACC, and we'll see what happens there. Notre Dame is sitting very pretty. I think a loss would still kill them if I had to imagine, with Alabama and Clemson and a lot of those teams sitting right outside. But maybe there's a little bit of an opening to lose the game this weekend, and maybe that's enough. The top 4 is unchanged and likely should be that way. I don't think you could argue that Penn State should be above Texas. I think that's a fair argument to be made, but at the end of the day, the top 4 is relatively unchanged, and I think that makes sense for most people out there. But let's get to the bracket, because that's what everyone wants to see right about now. The people that have buys are the exact same as last week. It is Oregon from the Big Ten, Texas from the SEC, Miami from the ACC, and Boise State from the Mountain West. And then you do have your Big 12 champion at the 12 spot in Arizona State. So kind of break it down real quickly, you do have an SEC matchup in the first round with Georgia and Tennessee. Would be the exact same matchup in the exact same place in Sanford Stadium. Then you do have Penn State, Indiana, which would be a very fun one to see. Didn't get to see it in the regular season, so would be very much into that. Notre Dame, SMU, I think would be a really fun matchup. SMU can really get after you, can really stretch a defense out, and that would kind of be Notre Dame's Achilles heel, being able to match them athlete for athlete on the outside and create some problems, especially without Benjamin Morrison. That would be a very interesting game. And let's talk about the Ohio State of it all here for a second, because as of right now, if Ohio State and Oregon win this weekend, I feel pretty confident saying they're playing for the 1 and the 5 seed. Whoever loses will get the 5, whoever wins will get the 1 seed. I think all of us kind of feel that way at this very moment. The question is, Ohio State as a 5 seed will play Arizona State, who I was just seeing would be a 20.5 point favorite over Arizona State, and then they would play Boise State. They'd probably be about a 21 point favorite over Boise State right about now. Oregon, however, would have to play the winner of Georgia-Tennessee. So they would have to, hypothetically, would have to play a Georgia team that seems to be hitting their stride at the right time, or a Tennessee team that isn't necessarily playing all that clean of football, but absolutely is a team that on one given Saturday could beat you up and get a win. So it feels like Oregon, as the number 1 seed, has a tougher path to the semifinal than Ohio State has, even playing the one game. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but we have to fix this one way or the other. We can't give all the auto buys to the top 4 conference champions. I'm fine with giving them auto bids. I don't love the idea. Frankly, if it was up to me, it would be 16 teams, no auto bids, and we would just play out the 16 best teams in the country. That's obviously not the world that we live in. So if you want to give them auto bids, I think that's more than fine. Giving them auto buys makes this scenario more real, makes the scenario where Ohio State can play Arizona State, and let's just say likely. I don't want to, bury Arizona State or Boise State by any means, but likely get a win there, likely get a win over Boise State, and probably show up a little bit more well-rested, a little bit healthier than that Oregon team after playing a Tennessee or after playing a Georgia. That is a problem that we just have to fix. One way or the other, it has to be the top 4 teams get those buys, because then if you're the 5 seed, you would maybe get an easier first-round matchup, but then you would play a really tough second round. That's the way that this should work out. The idea that anyone would even think about possibly, I don't want to say throwing, but losing their championship on Saturday. Let's say Oregon loses the Big Ten championship. They wouldn't be that upset. They wouldn't be really despondent or anything. They would say, okay, we're in a really good position to go on a run still, to still meet this same team in the semifinals and possibly win a national title. And then that's the other problem with this that I do have. Oregon is the number 1 team in the country. Ohio State is the number 2 team in the country. There is no world where they should be set up to meet before the national title. And I understand if they don't meet at the national title, that's more than fine. But the 2 best teams in the country should be on different sides of the bracket so we can see them hypothetically start to make their way towards that big time matchup at the end of the day. So there are a number of problems with this format. I think we all understand that at this point. I did not necessarily love it when they introduced it. I definitely don't love it now, but at the end of the day, this is what we have right now. I have to imagine that it will be changing this offseason, and we'll see what happens in the next couple of years. But as of right now, Ohio State, you're sitting really pretty. You're in a really good spot one way or the other, whether you get the 1 seed and have the bye, whether you get the 5 seed and play 2 games that you very well should win, you're in a really good spot. I think the one question here is what happens with the SEC title loser. I tend to believe that if Georgia were to lose the SEC championship, let's say they win this weekend and then lose to Texas, I think they would be the 8 seed. If Texas were to win this weekend and then lose to Georgia, maybe they'd slot a little bit higher because of that record, because they don't have the 3 losses at that point. Maybe they would slot above Penn State or above Notre Dame. That'll be an interesting thing to watch. Maybe they would even fall all the way to having to travel for a game. I'd be a little bit surprised with that, but as of right now, I think there's still a lot of doors that are very much open. And Penn State, Miami, Notre Dame, they might be a little bit more safe than we're realizing. I still think losses would put them in a very precarious situation, but maybe they're a little bit safer than we were thinking going into this one. And then Bama's lurking. That's what they do. They're still going to be in the mix, no doubt about it. And it'll be really interesting to see how this all unfolds. It's roughly what I expected from this ranking, but I think it showed just about everyone that was on the fence about it that this format is not the way that we want to go forward. It's a very, very fun thing, and I'm sure it'll be really fun to watch unfold, but the idea that a 5 seed would have a better run to the semifinal or the final than the 1 seed would is just not something that can happen. So these fixes are very, very attainable. We'll figure out in the offseason if they're capable of doing it, but going to be interesting to watch all of that unfold. A lot of unknowns that will likely be answered next week when we get all of this understood. We know who's in the conference championship, all of that type of stuff. So we'll obviously break that down next week when all of that stuff comes out, but let's take our first break here. And when we come back, we got some big game breakdowns we have to get to. Texas at Texas A&M, South Carolina at Clemson, two huge games that have some different implications after them, but we'll break them down right after this, so stick with us.